Welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. Over the last few videos, we covered the entire colonial era. It was pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. All the early colonies were led by men named John, apparently. Some colonists wanted to get rich quick, while others were looking for a place where they could be the religious majority. And like a few weirdos established truly enlightened colonies up in Connecticut and Rhode Island. It was great. Now, it's time to get into the American Revolution, or that time that we actually spilled the tea. Where did the American Revolution come from? Were the Founding Fathers genius visionaries who came up with this whole we don't need a king thing from scratch? Yes and no. The 1700s was part of the so-called Age of Enlightenment in Europe, and so also in the European colonies in North America. Over the past few hundred years, Europe had experienced a lot of dramatic shifts that totally changed its perspective. The Crusades reawakened Europe's curiosity about the wider world. Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492 made everyone question just how much they really knew. Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation challenged the man, in this case the Pope. Scientists were discovering that the Earth was governed by natural laws like gravity, and so political thinkers started to question the way things were as well. Historically, and by historically, I mean for like 99% of human history, civilizations had been governed by a single ruler with effectively absolute power. But as other pillars of traditional authority came crashing down, people started to wonder if that was the best way. It's important to note that most of the monoliths of the Enlightenment, especially our main guy, John Locke, still believed that a monarchy was the best form of government. True democracy seemed kind of insane, and it scared the hell out of the upper classes, including our own founding fathers. But a lot of enlightened thinkers began to wonder if there could be a compromise, a monarch that shared more power and responsibility with the people in some way. Keep in mind that the 1600s was the century of the English Civil War. They chop off King Charles's head, they go back and forth, they end up with this glorious revolution and the Bill of Rights. And so all of these ideas are trickling over into the English colonies by the 1700s. At the same time, colonial America in the mid-1700s was going through a religious revival known as the Great Awakening. Religious leaders were concerned because secularism was growing more common in the colonies. Another byproduct of the Enlightenment was an increasing separation between private religious views and public life. Basically, as generations had been born and raised in the colonies, they kind of lost this puritanical religious zeal that the original founders, especially in New England, had. And that freaked the religious leaders out. Many of the traveling preachers that led this Great Awakening emphasized egalitarianism. It was kind of like Martin Luther's Reformation 2.0. Preachers encouraged the colonists to develop a personal relationship with God rather than relying on their church's minister. Many of the colonies, especially in New England, grew more unified in this new uber-Protestant, kind of uniquely American form of Christianity, and the emphasis on individual rights of Christians to worship, read, and pray, mixed with Enlightenment ideals to create a growing sense of individualism in the colonies. This all was helped along by the fact that, one, they were really far away from their mother country, and two, Britain kind of left the American colonies alone. As long as they were getting their sugar, cotton, tobacco, money, the British looked the other way, as Americans maybe sold some excess goods on the black market to Spain, whatever. And this system of salutary or benign neglect worked until Britain needed something from the colonists. The British had just finished fighting a costly war known as the 7 Years' War, and honestly, it's not really important for us to know much about this war, except that on opposite sides were Britain and France, and they fought in Europe, but also in North America, where both powers had colonies. On our continent, we call this the French and Indian War because the American colonists were fighting against, you guessed it, the French and Indians. There were indigenous people fighting on both sides, but whatever. Yada yada yada, the British won. As part of the peace deal, they got the highly coveted Ohio Territory, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Side note, the amount of war and turmoil that is going to be fought over Ohio will shock you. Except, the British immediately issued a proclamation in 1763 called the Proclamation of 1763, saying that the colonists could not go into this newly conquered territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. What? Why did they prevent American settlers from crossing the Appalachians? Well, you see, over in that Ohio River Valley, there were a lot of indigenous people, and they didn't really agree that France had the right to give away their territory in this peace treaty. So they gathered behind a leader named Pontiac and launched a rebellion in 1763, basically saying to the British, if you want this land, you're going to have to continue fighting for it. And the British were like, we don't have the money for that. Keep in mind that this was one of the biggest motivations for American colonists to take up arms and join the Redcoats fighting in this French and Indian War, is they thought they would be rewarded with land west of the Appalachian Mountains, but that didn't happen and that pissed them off. Well, they didn't really have the resources to administer the settled lands they already had because they were in debt. Yeah, wars are expensive, even if you win them. And so the British looked at their established policy of basically leaving the American colonists alone and thought, yeah, it's not going to cut it anymore. So throughout the 1760s and early 1770s, they imposed a series of taxes on the colonists. You all know the drill. You've seen Schoolhouse Rock, right? The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, etc. If the colonists had it, the British taxed it. And now just a quick note on this. From the British perspective, this was all 100% reasonable. They felt like the colonists had been getting off pretty easy for years. A lot of the taxes they imposed were the same taxes that British citizens had been paying over in the UK for decades. And the American colonists were still subjects of the crown, so why should they not have to pay, especially when it's to pay for their own defense? Now, obviously, from the American perspective, this was seen as unfair. Really, the core reason is just because everyone in history always hates taxes, no matter what, forever. Just remember that. But they also felt like if they were going to get taxed by Parliament, then they should have better representation in Parliament. Now, they made this catchier by chanting, say it with me now, no taxation without representation. It's a good slogan because it rhymes. Now, at this point, I want to make sure we're all still clear that up until now, the colonies have been completely separate. I mean, Benjamin Franklin made that famous snake cartoon, Join or Die, to try to convince the colonies to unite and fight as one in the French and Indian War, with like mild success. But really, the concept of being an American kind of didn't exist. You were a Virginian or a Rhode Islander or a Massachusettsian, Cape Codder? I don't know, I've literally never thought about that before. So these taxes had the unintended consequence of starting to unite the colonies together in a common cause, or really a common complaint. The leaders of the various colonies started getting together and comparing notes, and they started broing out about how much they have in common. Like, oh wait, y'all hate the Quartering Act too? We hate the Quartering Act. Sweet. The first major one of these bro gatherings was the Stamp Act Congress of 1765. The British Parliament had passed a tax on stamps. Nope. Actually, it was a tax on paper. All legal documents, calendars, newspapers, playing cards, etc. had to have the official stamp showing that you had paid the tax. This was a big deal because it impacted essentially all business in the colonies and newspapers, and we were not for it. The Stamp Act Congress met in Federal Hall in New York City and issued the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Warning, get ready for a lot of congresses and a lot of declarations. Basically, they were all just different versions of colonists saying, Britain, stop it. This declaration was where they issued their no taxation without representation argument and called for colonial representatives in Parliament chosen by the colonists. In this same year, the Sons of Liberty was also formed in Boston by Sam Adams and others. This was essentially a loose underground organization that led the resistance against perceived British oppression. And I just want to note that this group, from the British view, was a rebel terrorist organization. Like, they sacked and burned the homes and property of prominent British officials, and they often incited mob violence in the name of overthrowing the government. Young men would come over from England to serve the empire as customs officers, and they would refuse to get off the ship because they could see mobs of colonists waiting at the dock to just beat them up. But like, we won the war, so they get to be heroic revolutionaries instead of rebellious traitors. Perspective. Long story short, the king actually repealed the Stamp Act. Woohoo, we won! But also no, he started sending more forces to the colonies, especially to New York and Boston, which were hotbeds for this revolutionary sentiment. And he clarified that while he was repealing this act, he was still the king and could actually do whatever he wanted in the colonies. In 1770, a street fight between colonists and British soldier escalated into a chaotic riot. The so-called Boston Massacre resulted in 5 deaths and sparked outrage across the colonies. Although it's not clear who started it, the perception in the colonies was that the British military was now attacking its own people, and that didn't look great. At this point, things start escalating. By 1773, the British imposed a new tax on tea. Let's pause here for a clarification, because this always gets mixed up. I even mixed up when I was saying it. We're talking about the Tea Act of 1773, which was not a tax on tea. Actually, what the Tea Act of 1773 did was it allowed the British official, like East India Company tea, to remove certain taxes on tea to lower the price. So why were colonists mad if the price of tea was going down? Turns out British East India Company tea was not the only tea that the colonists were drinking. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled YouTube video. Tea was being smuggled by the colonists, like a lot of it. So the British East India Company had a monopoly on tea sold to the American colonies. Remember, mercantilism. By 1765, tea alone made up anywhere from 70 to 90% of the company's profits. It was critical to their business. But Americans had also been smuggling in cheaper, non-company tea for years. Let me point out now that some of the earliest revolutionaries, including many members of the Sons of Liberty, were also tea smugglers. So like that Boston Tea Party thing, maybe a little less about freedom and independence and more about gang leaders getting rid of the competition, but I don't know. Over time, the British East India Company had come to represent the oppressive powers of mercantilism and the king. By the 1760s, the company was in debt, which was a threat to the British government because they relied on the company's profits for a lot of its budget. The tea market in Europe and England was already saturated, like people can only drink so much tea in a day. So they started shipping more and more to the colonies. On the one hand, this actually brought the price of tea down, which in theory was good, but slowly it kind of started to feel like British tea was being forced down the throats of the colonists. Basically, the system was like a big pyramid scheme. American commissioners had signed contracts with the company to sell all the imported tea in the Americas. They were legally obligated to fulfill those contracts. If they didn't sell the tea, they would lose their commission. They would lose their ship, lose the money that they had fronted to get the tea in the first place. It was high pressure. You know that acquaintance from high school on Facebook that was trying to sell you leggings for a while, then maybe like essential oils or nutritional supplements? Basically, the British East India Company had turned into a worldwide MLM. And so, as the East India Company sent more and more shipments of tea, American commissioners were forced to take it on and find ways to sell it to colonists. And this angered many Americans, but it also made the value of the illegal tea being smuggled in by many young men go way down in price, and they were not happy about that. So famously, a few members of the Sons of Liberty dressed as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. How much tea was that? Well, it could have brewed 18.5 million cups of tea, and in modern currency, it cost $1.7 million in damage for the company. So they were not happy. As punishment, the British passed the Intolerable Acts to punish Boston. Now, they didn't call them that. That would be really bad PR. The colonists nicknamed them Intolerable. Basically, the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter was revoked, and the king implemented martial law in Massachusetts. General Thomas Gage, commander of all British troops in North America, was put directly in charge of the colony, along with 4,000 redcoat soldiers to back him up. And I want to point out that dictators always do this. Like whenever I'm watching the news and I hear about protests happening somewhere in the world, students marching on a square, mothers demonstrating in a plaza, I just wait for the disproportionate government response. Like, just sit down with them at the table and give them a tiny bit of what they want, right? Nope. Without fail, they will send in tanks or soldiers or tear gas or rubber bullets, and they escalate an isolated protest into a national movement. Which begs the question, why didn't the British just give us representation in Parliament? I mean, for one, this would set a precedent that all colonies could get representation. Remember that Britain already had other colonies around the world, and they were planning on acquiring more. I see you, India. They didn't really want other colonists getting the idea that if they objected loudly enough, they could get their way. That's not really how imperialism works. But there were also logistical questions, like would the representatives stay in England? Then they wouldn't be colonists anymore. Would they cross the ocean every time Parliament was in session? That would take months. How would that representation work, right? The North American population was huge. There were over 1 million colonists living in the English Americas by 1750, compared with around 6 million people in the entire UK. That would have seriously changed the balance of power in Parliament. So yeah, not gonna happen. Despite these issues, maybe Britain could have just given us representation in Parliament and we could have avoided this whole revolution, but They didn't, and their militaristic treatment of Boston probably did more to unite the colonies together than anything else. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. At this point, in 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. All but one of the colonies sent a representative. Looking at you, Georgia. They wanted to discuss next steps. There were tons of different ideas about how the colonies should respond, but very few people were advocating for a revolution right now. The Congress was really tense because these colonists didn't know each other. Remember from the last episode, each colony was unique. They all had different relationships with Britain. But they got past their distrust and proposed a continental government made up of a popularly elected Grand Council that would represent the interests of the colonies. Essentially, it would be like a continental parliament elected by the colonists. To appease the king, they proposed a president general who would represent the king's authority in the colonies and would be chosen directly by the king. The king was not on board. In a speech to Parliament, he denounced the daring spirit of resistance and disobedience to the law that was occurring across the Atlantic. Frustrated that no one seemed to be listening in England, the colonists embarked on a mass boycott of British goods. Various colonial assemblies were constantly meeting to discuss the situation and decide what to do next. The most famous of these was in Virginia. In 1775, as Virginia delegates were debating how to deal with Britain, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry stood up from his pew. Frustrated at the ineffective declarations and the lack of unity amongst the colonies, he declared that the distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, I am an American. He then proposed a resolution to raise a Virginia militia to protect the colonists from the crown. Oh, hey, treason. He was not the first to propose this. Other colonies had begun forming their own defense, but there were still many who viewed this as a really extreme step. But Henry convinced many who were there with his famous speech. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Apparently, as he was saying that, he raised his hands like they were in chains and then broke free, grabbed a letter opener, and mimed plunging the knife into his heart. Give me death. The dude had style, and it worked. Virginia passed a resolution to ready themselves for combat, with Patrick Henry in charge of the effort. Thomas Jefferson, who was in attendance, later wrote, "It is not now easy to say what we should have done without Patrick Henry. He was before us all in maintaining the spirit of the revolution." So at this point, the revolution has basically begun. I mean, once you start building up a military to fight against your own government, yeah, you're basically in a revolution. They just had to dot the I and cross the T in independent, but essentially, we're on the road to war. I want us to think for a second why Virginia was such an important colony to bring over to the revolutionary side. Virginia was the original colony, and it had such close ties to England, economically and socially, right? They had so much to gain from maintaining trading ties with England and a lot to lose from breaking away. And so if the New Englanders, who had already been slowly breaking away from England since the Puritans showed up on Plymouth Rock, if they could get Virginia on their side, this massive wealthy colony, they knew that the revolution could be successful. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and go check out patreon.com/antisocialstudies.